Welcome to KNN. KNN is brought to you by Bob Knakal, Chairman of New York Investment Sales at JLL.
Hi, I'm Jon Hageman, Managing Director at JLL. Welcome to KNN. Today I'm here with Bob Knakal, Chairman of New York Investment Sales at JLL. And today we're going to talk about the recent changes to the rent regulation law in New York. So Bob, there was a new legislation that came out a short while ago that has significantly impacted the rent regulation laws in New York City. We have a lot to unpack here and talk about. Why don't you just give a brief overview of that legislation and what's happened so far?
Yeah, that's a really loaded question, Hags. There's a lot there. I think it's important. Maybe some of our viewers are not that familiar with rent regulation, the rent control, the rent stabilization. Basically, the current rent laws initially went into effect in 1974, basically a addendum to the rent control laws that were enacted right after the wartime so that people returning from the war wouldn't get gouged with rents going up too high. So the intent was very good to try to create a scenario where things didn't get out of control. In 1974, the rent stabilization law went into effect, and it was actually something that was designed to try to make the market better and try to make conditions for landlords reasonable, for tenants reasonable, because in the 1970s things weren't so great in the city. You know, a lot of the changes to the laws that were enacted in the 70s were in response to the fact that in those days there was a 14% dilapidation rate in the city, meaning 14% of the housing units were effectively uninhabitable. They were in such bad condition. So there were things put into the law to create an incentive for the private sector to invest in the housing stock. We didn't want people burning their buildings down to collect insurance money rather than invest in them. We wanted the private sector to invest in the housing stock. And so that's effectively what the laws did. They created incentives for the private sector to invest in the housing stock, increase the quality of life for people living in those buildings, get a reasonable return on their investment, etc. We've had this period we've gone through where the laws have been relatively even-handed in terms of providing benefits and motivation for the private sector and ownership, and also providing protections for tenants. And recently, based on the swing in power in Albany, there was a concern right after the elections in November that these laws might swing very, very much in favor of the tenants, and it seems like it may have done that.
So Bob, with that being said, why don't you share some of the hot headline changes to the laws?
Right. Well, probably the biggest incentive or the biggest motivator for the private sector to invest in the housing stock was the major capital improvement program and the individual apartment improvement program. Both of those were designed to, again, deploy private sector dollars into the housing stock. The MCI program was one in which if you did major repairs to a building, you put in new roof, new windows, new boiler, renovated the lobby, you did something that everyone in the building would benefit from, you could pass along part of that cost to the tenants in the form of a permanent monthly rent increase. Similarly, with an individual apartment, if an owner went in and did a complete renovation to increase the quality of that unit, a percentage of that cost could be passed along in the form of a higher rent. And so because of these programs, the quality of the housing stock has gotten so much better that 14% dilapidation rate we had in the 1970s is now 0.04%. And both of those programs were not eliminated, but they were significantly marginalized to the point where there is really not incentive to invest in your unit today.
Bob, why don't you go into more detail about that, of what exactly changed on those calculations for the MCI and IAI?
Sure. Well, for the MCI program, now 67% of the amount that could have been passed along is now eliminated. The city is also going to scrutinize the actual repairs that you do in the MCI program to see whether they qualify as being eligible to be passed along. And with regard to the individual apartment improvement, most apartment improvements that owners do to their units in the range of $60,000 to $75,000. The amount that you can put into an apartment today is only $15,000 over a 15-year period, which means that depending on the size of your building, how many units you have, the most you can increase the rent by improving the apartment is either $83 or $89 a month. So virtually no incentive for anyone to renovate units. And on top of those two programs being marginalized, the vacancy bonus, which would allow you to increase the legal rent by 20% every time a tenant left, that has been eliminated as well. So it's virtually impossible to get rents up to free market levels if the unit is stabilized today.
So also previously, you could remove apartments from the rent regulation system through a variety of ways, and now that is no longer the case, correct?
Right. Well, even with a tenant in place, if you had a legal rent that got above the threshold, it became deregulated based on high rent. If the tenant was making more than a certain amount of income for 2 years in a row, they would have high income deregulation. So there are a number of ways that you could have gotten units out, not only by getting a vacant apartment and taking the vacancy bonus and adding the individual apartment improvement and an MCI increase to get it above the legal threshold. So there were a number of ways that you could take units out of the regulated stock, and that is impossible to do today.
Bob, you meant one of the things you just said was talked about the high income threshold. So now with the new law the way it is, someone that's making in excess of even $500,000, $1 million, technically they could be in a rent regulated apartment.
Absolutely. That's one of the great fallacies about rent regulation, is that every politician refers to it as an affordable housing program, but there's really nothing that measures the necessity of a low rent for a particular tenant. There's no means testing of any kind. It really is a public benefit that's being handed out by the private sector, and it's being handed out randomly because there's no means testing, there's no knowledge of whether the tenant really needs that subsidy or not. So it's kind of a situation that it may be serving its intended purpose, but may not be, because there's no way to know.